boring history for bedtime, medieval bathroom habits, chamber pots, moats, and misery. Hey everyone, tonight's episode is about something we all do, but in the Middle Ages, it was a whole different ordeal. We're talking about how people went to the bathroom, chamber pots, garderobes, moats full of human waste. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't hygienic. Forget castles and courtly love. This is the part of medieval life they don't show you in movies. So if you're ready to learn how folks really did their business in the 13th century, turn on a fan for a little white noise, get comfortable, and let's get into it. We'll walk through castle corridors to examine the garderobes of the nobility, venture into peasant cottages to understand the daily realities of rural waste disposal, and meet the unsung heroes who made medieval sanitation possible. It's a journey through the practical, the primitive, and the occasionally perilous world of medieval waste management, a world where your social standing determined not just where you lived, but how and where you relieved yourself. Chapter 1. The Stone Seats of Power, Castle Garderobes and Noble Necessities. Let us begin with the castles of 13th century France, those imposing stone monuments to power and privilege that dotted the landscape like massive gray teeth. Within these walls lived the nobility, and with privilege came certain comforts, including what were arguably the most sophisticated toilet facilities of the medieval world. These weren't bathrooms as we understand them today, but rather small, purposeful chambers known as garderobes or privies, built directly into the thick stone walls of the castle. The word garderobe originally meant to guard the robes, and there was a practical reason for this naming. These small toilet chambers often doubled as storage spaces for clothing, based on the medieval belief that the pungent ammonia fumes from human waste would kill moths, lice, and other fabric-eating pests. It was an early form of pest control, even if it meant your finest garments carried a rather distinctive odor. A typical castle garderobe was never larger than absolutely necessary. Space was precious in medieval construction, and every square foot had to serve a purpose. Picture a small closet, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet at most, carved directly into the thick stone wall of the castle. The floor might be strewn with rushes, those long grasses that served as medieval carpeting, mixed with aromatic herbs like lavender or mint to combat the persistent smell. The walls were sometimes whitewashed with lime plaster, which served 2 purposes: brightening the tiny, often windowless space, and taking advantage of lime's natural antibacterial properties. Some garderobes even featured small windows or slits, not for the view, but for ventilation. These openings were typically left unshuttered, allowing air to flow through the chamber and carry away the worst of the odors. This was medieval air conditioning of a sort, using natural airflow to make the experience slightly less unpleasant. The centerpiece of any garderobe was the seat itself, a wooden bench, carefully crafted to fit across the stone shaft that dropped down through the wall. The opening in this bench was typically rectangular or keyhole-shaped, sized for function rather than comfort. Some of the more elaborate garderobes featured cushioned seats, a luxury that spoke to the owner's wealth and status. Beneath this seat was the shaft, a vertical chute that might drop 20, 30, or even 50 feet down through the stone wall to its eventual outlet. Many garderobes were located near the Lord's bedchamber, or just off the Great Hall, providing easy access during long meetings or formal dinners. Some featured short passages with right-angle turns, designed to provide privacy, and prevent the direct flow of odors into the main living areas. The more elaborate castles might have doors on their garderobes, a rare luxury in an age when privacy was scarce, though many made do with simple cloth hangings. In larger castles, you might find multiple garderobes sharing the same waste chute. Coity Castle in Wales featured 3 tiers of toilets, one above the other, all emptying into the same courtyard basement. This vertical arrangement was both practical and economical, concentrating the castle's waste disposal into a single system. Langley Castle employed a similar design, with several garderobes feeding into a common pit that was periodically washed clean by a natural stream diverted for that purpose. The engineering of these systems was more sophisticated than one might expect. The garderobe shafts were typically built to project outward from the castle's exterior walls, supported by stone corbels, those bracket-like supports that jutted from the wall face. This projection served a crucial purpose. It ensured that waste would fall outside the castle walls, rather than accumulating against the foundation. Even King Henry III once complained in a 13th century letter that one castle's privy smells badly and ordered a new one built in a more fitting place, even though it should cost £100, a sum that could have fed a peasant family for years. This demonstrates both the priority placed on sanitary comfort by the wealthy and the significant expense involved in medieval plumbing improvements. Yet despite these engineering marvels, the reality remained decidedly unpleasant. The stench was legendary. Contemporary accounts describe the smell as stinking to high heaven, and even the nobility found it barely tolerable. The ammonia fumes were so strong that people would hang their clothes in the garderobe chambers, believing the pungent vapors would kill lice and mites in the fabrics, thus guarding the robes while creating an even more potent smell. Chapter 2: Medieval Disposal Systems and Their Consequences. The waste disposal from these garderobes varied depending on the castle's location and construction, but the underlying principle remained the same. Use gravity to move human waste away from living areas and worry about the consequences later. Many castle garderobes emptied directly into the castle's moat, turning that defensive water barrier into a massive, open sewer. Picture those romantic moats you see in fairy tales. Now imagine them filled not with clear, defensive water, but with a fetid mixture of human waste, kitchen scraps, and whatever else the castle inhabitants saw fit to dispose of. The moat at Bodiam Castle, for example, received waste from no fewer than 28 garderobes, creating a defensive barrier that was as much chemical weapon as physical obstacle. Other castles dropped waste into defensive ditches or down cliffsides if the castle was built on elevated terrain. Dover Castle featured a large cesspit at the base of the keep's wall, designed to collect waste from multiple garderobes above. This cesspit would be periodically emptied by servants or local laborers, a task that was both necessary and thoroughly despised. For castles built along rivers, the garderobes often emptied directly into the flowing water, allowing the current to carry away the waste. This seemed like an elegant solution until you consider that these same rivers often supplied drinking water to towns downstream. The concept of water contamination was not well understood in the 13th century, leading to the inadvertent spread of waterborne diseases that would claim thousands of lives. To mitigate the worst of the accumulation and stench, some castles implemented primitive flushing systems. Servants might toss buckets of water down the latrine shaft to rinse it, creating a rudimentary version of the flush toilet. Some castles cleverly diverted kitchen wastewater into the toilet chutes, using the grease and liquid from cooking to help wash away accumulated waste. A few particularly sophisticated castles had cisterns or gutters designed to channel rainwater into the shafts during storms, providing an occasional heavy rinse that cleaned the chutes more thoroughly. But these systems created their own problems. The garderobe shafts, while functional, represented potential security vulnerabilities in the castle's defenses. The most famous example occurred in 1203 at Chateau Gaillard on the River Seine, built by King Richard the Lionheart. During a siege, a group of attackers managed to scale the castle walls by climbing up through the latrine shaft, essentially entering the castle through its toilet. This audacious infiltration led to the castle's capture and prompted immediate modifications. A masonry wall was hastily built around the sewer outlet to prevent any repeat invasions. Medieval military engineers became acutely aware that garderobes represented weak points in fortress defenses, and later castle designs often included defensive measures around waste outlets. The risks weren't limited to military concerns. The structure of garderobe shafts themselves posed ongoing hazards. These vertical passages, often built into the hollow interior of castle walls, required periodic cleaning and maintenance. Servants tasked with this duty faced the danger of falling into the shafts, particularly when the wooden planking around the toilet seats became rotten from constant moisture and waste exposure. The gases produced by decomposing waste created another serious hazard. Methane and hydrogen sulfide could accumulate in the enclosed spaces of castle waste systems, causing workers to faint or even suffocate when they entered the areas for cleaning. This danger was particularly acute in deeper cesspits or in garderobes that had been sealed for extended periods. Weather presented additional challenges for castle waste disposal. During heavy rains, the garderobe shafts could overflow, flooding the lower levels of the castle with diluted sewage. Winter freezing could block the shafts entirely, forcing castle residents to rely solely on chamber pots until spring thaw cleared the obstruction. Snow and ice around the exterior outlets could create backup problems that lasted for months. The accumulation of waste also attracted vermin and created health hazards that medieval people, while not understanding the mechanisms of disease transmission, clearly recognized as dangerous. Rats, flies, and other pests were drawn to the waste areas, and these creatures then spread throughout the castle, contaminating food supplies and living areas. Chapter 3: Chamber Pots and the Rituals of Noble Relief. Beyond the fixed installations of garderobes, castle life also relied heavily on portable sanitation solutions, primarily in the form of chamber pots. These humble vessels played a crucial role in medieval castle hygiene, providing convenience and flexibility that the fixed garderobe systems could not match. Chamber pots in noble households were far from the crude buckets used by commoners. These were often crafted from glazed ceramic, pewter, or even silver, depending on the wealth and status of the owner. The finest examples featured decorative elements, painted flowers, family crests, or religious symbols, transforming a utilitarian object into a piece of household art. The wealthy might own multiple chamber pots of different sizes for different purposes, from small personal vessels to larger family-sized containers. The use of chamber pots was governed by strict etiquette and ritual, particularly in the households of the highest nobility. For kings and queens, the chamber pot ceremony was as formal as any court ritual. The groom of the stool was a prestigious position in royal households, responsible for attending to the monarch's most intimate needs. This servant would prepare the chamber pot, assist the royal person in its use, and dispose of the contents afterward. The royal close stool was often an elaborate piece of furniture, a wooden box upholstered in rich velvet or brocade, with a hinged lid that concealed a pewter or ceramic pot within. Some featured cushioned seats, armrests, and even small shelves for holding reading materials or personal items. The position was considered an honor because it provided intimate access to the ruler, and many important political conversations took place during these private moments. For lesser nobility, chamber pot etiquette was somewhat less formal, but still governed by clear social rules. Children were taught proper chamber pot use as part of their basic education, learning not only the physical mechanics, but also the social expectations surrounding privacy, cleanliness, and disposal. Noble women, in particular, were expected to maintain strict modesty around chamber pot use, often requiring the assistance of ladies-in-waiting, who helped preserve their dignity while attending to necessity. The timing of chamber pot use reflected the rhythms of medieval castle life. Night use was the most common, as trekking to a cold, drafty garderobe in the dark was both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Many nobles kept personal chamber pots in their bedchambers, allowing them to relieve themselves without leaving the warmth and safety of their private quarters. During long meetings, formal dinners, or court ceremonies, discreet chamber pot use might be necessary to avoid disrupting important proceedings. Medieval banquets could last for hours, and the combination of multiple courses and flowing wine made bathroom breaks inevitable. Rather than interrupt the festivities, nobles might quietly excuse themselves to use a chamber pot in a nearby alcove or private chamber. The disposal of chamber pot contents was a daily ritual that required careful coordination among castle servants. Each morning, chamber pots throughout the castle would be collected, emptied, and cleaned before being returned to their designated locations. The contents typically went into the castle's main waste disposal system, either poured down garderobe shafts or carried outside to designated waste areas. The cleaning of chamber pots was itself a skilled task. Servants used various methods to ensure the vessels were properly sanitized for reuse. Water was the primary cleaning agent, often heated and mixed with soap made from animal fats and ash. Some households used vinegar or wine for additional disinfection, while others employed herbs and aromatic substances to mask any lingering odors. At night or in inclement weather, even a lord might not trek to the chilly privy. Instead, they used a portable chamber pot in the bedroom. The contents of chamber pots would be dumped into the castle's latrine shaft or emptied outside by servants each morning. In essence, castle residents had the luxury of both an internal latrine and chamber pots at hand, a stark contrast to common peasants who had neither. Chapter 4: Peasant Sanitation and Rural Realities. Having examined the relative luxuries of castle sanitation, let us now descend from the castle walls to explore how the vast majority of 13th century French people, the peasants and rural villagers, managed their most basic human needs. For these common folk, waste disposal was not a matter of engineering sophistication or social ritual, but of practical survival in a world where comfort was secondary to simply getting through each day. The typical peasant dwelling in 13th century France was a modest affair, often a single room shared by an entire family, with perhaps a loft for storage and sleeping. These homes had no running water, no plumbing, and certainly no built-in toilet facilities. Instead, peasant families relied on outdoor solutions that varied depending on their location, the season, and their economic circumstances. The most common rural toilet facility was the simple cesspit, dug at a distance from the house, that balanced convenience with sanitation concerns. These pits were typically located downwind from the dwelling and positioned to avoid contaminating the family's water source, though medieval understanding of groundwater contamination was limited, and wells were sometimes located dangerously close to waste disposal areas. A typical cesspit might be 3 to 4 feet across and 5 to 6 feet deep, lined with stones if the family could afford the labor and materials. Over these cesspits, families would construct simple wooden structures that provided basic privacy and protection from the elements. These necessaries, or jakes, were essentially small shacks, with a wooden seat featuring a hole cut to the appropriate size. Some families erected a small wooden outhouse over the pit to provide a bit of privacy and a wooden seat with a hole. This not only made the experience a little more comfortable, but also reduced the chance of someone accidentally falling into the cesspit. Many peasants, however, made do with no structure at all. As one historian puts it bluntly, to relieve oneself in the countryside, one could go behind a bush. Open-air defecation in fields, forests, or against a far wall was common for laborers working outside all day. The agricultural cycle heavily influenced peasant sanitation practices. During planting and harvest seasons, workers often spent entire days away from their homes, necessitating improvised solutions in barns, fields, or wooded areas. At home, peasants often used chamber pots or other containers, especially at night. Trekking outside in the dark or cold was unpleasant and could be dangerous, so a simple bucket or clay pot served as the nighttime toilet in the corner of a peasant cottage. Come morning, the contents would be dumped onto the farm's manure heap, into a cesspit, or perhaps scattered on fallow ground. It was not unheard of for people in upper-story dwellings to fling waste from chamber pots out the window, giving rise to the warning cry, "Gardez-le, gardez-l'eau" in French, meaning "watch out for water," in later centuries to alert passers-by of incoming foul water. However, local rules usually forbade dumping waste in the street, and violators could be fined if caught. The more responsible approach was to empty one's chamber pot in a designated pit or midden heap. In rural communities, human waste was often valued as fertilizer. Peasants would mix it with animal manure and spread it on fields to enrich the soil. This practice meant that cesspits had to be shoveled out periodically, a task either done by the farmers themselves or by gong farmers, night soil collectors, if available. Privacy for peasant bathroom needs was minimal. If a family's home privy was just a hole in the ground or a rickety shack, it might not even have a door, perhaps just a cloth hung up, or nothing at all. Many poorer folk simply squatted in the open, hopefully concealed by a hedge or fence. Large families sharing small living spaces had little opportunity for private bodily functions. Children learned to use toilet facilities in full view of family members, and adults often had to coordinate their bathroom needs around the schedules and presence of others. Communal latrines were not common in tiny villages, but on some estates or manor villages, a landowner might provide a basic, common privy for tenant families. More often, several households shared one cesspit area or latrine by informal arrangement. In towns or more populated villages, it was typical for multiple families to share a single outside toilet, or for a cluster of small privies to drain into a communal cesspool that everyone contributed to. These communal pits were sometimes lined with stone and were emptied regularly by laborers to prevent overflow and unbearable stench. Still, hygiene was hit or miss. Medieval records contain complaints of neighbors' privies leaking into adjoining properties or people failing to maintain their cesspools. One grim incident from 1326 tells of a man in London who sat down on his privy and the wooden planks broke, dumping him into the cesspit where he drowned. Such tragedies underscore how rudimentary and unsafe these facilities could be for common folk. Chapter 5: Gong Farmers and the Economics of Medieval Waste. Having explored the various facilities and systems used for waste disposal in medieval France, let us now turn our attention to the remarkable individuals who made these systems function. The gong farmers, night soil men, and other sanitation workers who dealt directly with society's waste. These men performed some of the most unpleasant and dangerous work in medieval society, yet they were also among the best paid laborers of their time. The term gong farmer derives from the Old English gang, meaning to go, which eventually came to refer to both human waste and the facilities used to collect it. These men were also known by various other names: nightmen, rakers, muckrakers, and night soil collectors. Whatever they were called, their job was the same: to dig out, collect, and dispose of human waste from the cesspits, garderobes, and public latrines that served medieval communities. The work of a gong farmer was strictly regulated by local authorities, who recognized both its necessity and its potential for creating public health hazards. In most cities, gong farmers were only permitted to work between 9 in the evening and 5 in the morning, keeping their activities hidden from public view during daylight hours. This nighttime restriction served multiple purposes. It reduced public exposure to the sights and smells of waste collection, minimized disruption to daily commerce, and helped maintain the dignity of a profession that society needed, but preferred not to acknowledge. The tools of the gong farmers' trade were simple, but essential. Wooden shovels and buckets were the primary implements, along with long-handled ladles for removing liquid waste. Ropes and pulleys helped lift heavy containers from deep cesspits, while carts and barrels provided transportation for the collected waste. Some gong farmers employed assistants, often young boys who could fit into confined spaces and help with the lifting and carrying that the job required. The physical demands of gong farming were extreme. Workers often labored waist-deep, chest-deep, or even neck-deep in human excrement, digging out compacted waste that had accumulated for months or years. The largest cesspit cleanings could take teams of men several nights to complete. Records from 1281 describe 13 men working 5 full nights to empty a single privy at Newgate Jail in England, illustrating the massive scale of some waste disposal projects. The health hazards faced by gong farmers were substantial and poorly understood in medieval times. Exposure to methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic gases could cause workers to faint or suffocate in the pits they were cleaning. Drowning in waste was a documented cause of death for some gong farmers, particularly when they worked alone or in poorly ventilated areas. One famous case from 1326 tells of Richard the Raker, a London gong farmer who fell into his own cesspit and drowned in the waste he was trying to remove. Disease transmission was another major risk for these workers. Handling human waste exposed gong farmers to cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and various parasitic infections. Despite these hazards, Gong farming was surprisingly well-compensated work. In late 15th century England, gong farmers charged 2 shillings per ton of waste removed, a substantial sum that reflected both the difficulty of the work and the scarcity of people willing to perform it. Many gong farmers earned more in a single night than common laborers made in a week, making this one of the best paid occupations available to men without formal education or training. The men employed to undertake the foul-smelling task of emptying cesspits were called gong farmers or gong farmers. Not surprisingly, these men were well paid, and the gong farmers of medieval London usually ended their day with a much-needed dip in the River Thames. The disposal of collected waste was as important as its collection. Gong farmers had to transport their loads outside city boundaries to designated dumping areas, often traveling several miles to reach approved disposal sites. Some of this waste was sold to farmers as fertilizer, creating a secondary market that provided additional income for gong farmers while serving agricultural needs. Legal regulations surrounding gong farming were extensive and strictly enforced. Cities issued licenses to waste removal professionals, specifying their operating hours, disposal methods, and pricing structures. Violations could result in substantial fines, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. One documented case describes a London gong farmer who improperly disposed of waste, being forced to stand immersed in human excrement up to his neck, then displayed publicly as punishment for his violation of waste disposal regulations. Gong farmers usually employed a couple of young boys to lift the full buckets of ordure out of the pit and to work in confined spaces. After being dug out, the solid waste was removed in large barrels or pipes, which were loaded onto a horse-drawn cart. Up to 3 or 4 men were often required for the job, with one shoveling the feces into buckets, another pulling those up with a rope, and the rest carrying those loads onto their cart. The social status of gong farmers was complex and contradictory. While their work was essential and well paid, they were often considered social outcasts due to the nature of their occupation. Many communities required gong farmers to live in designated areas away from the general population, and some social restrictions limited their participation in community activities. Chapter 6: The Complexity of City Waste. As we move from the isolated realities of rural life, let us now explore the complex world of urban sanitation in 13th century French cities. Here, the concentration of people in small areas created waste disposal challenges that dwarfed anything faced by castle dwellers or rural peasants. Cities like Paris, Lyon, and Toulouse struggled with the fundamental problem of how to manage human waste when thousands of people lived in close proximity without modern sewage systems. Medieval French cities were vertical worlds where families lived in multi-story buildings, often with shops or workshops on the ground floor and living quarters above. These structures were built close together along narrow streets, creating dense urban environments where waste disposal became a community-wide challenge. Each building might house multiple families, and the sheer volume of human waste produced daily required systematic solutions that went far beyond individual household management. The most common urban toilet facility was the shared privy, typically located in courtyards behind buildings or in communal areas accessible to multiple families. These structures were larger and more substantially built than rural necessaries, often featuring multiple seats arranged side by side to accommodate several users simultaneously. Privacy was minimal. Users might be separated by low wooden partitions, but conversations and other activities continued normally during toilet use. Urban privies typically emptied into large communal cesspits that served entire neighborhoods. These pits were substantial excavations, sometimes 15 or 20 feet deep, and lined with stone to prevent collapse. The liquid waste would seep into the surrounding soil, often contaminating nearby wells and water sources, while solid waste accumulated until the pit required emptying. The narrow streets of medieval cities created unique challenges for waste disposal. When household chamber pots needed emptying, the contents often found their way into the street gutters that ran along the center or sides of the roadway. During rainy periods, these gutters would carry waste away toward rivers or out of the city entirely. But during dry spells, human and animal waste would accumulate in the streets, creating unsanitary conditions and overwhelming odors. People in the Middle Ages were no less sensitive to foul odors or disgusted by human waste than we are. They also did not understand exactly how human waste could spread disease. But they knew it did. They just thought it was something to do with its odors. So medieval towns and cities actually had a lot of ordinances and laws to do with waste disposal, latrines, and toilets. In medieval London, for example, people were responsible for the upkeep and cleanliness of the street outside their houses. The fines that could be imposed on them if they didn't do this could be extremely onerous. One account talks of an outraged mob badly beating a stranger who littered their street with the skin of a smoked fish, since they didn't want to have to pay the heavy fine for his laziness. The infamous practice of throwing chamber pot contents from upper-story windows was not as common as popular misconceptions suggest, but it did occur frequently enough to require legal prohibition in many cities. The warning cry, "Garde l'eau," watch out for the water, supposedly alerted passers-by to incoming waste, though most city ordinances specifically forbade this practice and imposed heavy penalties on violators. Public latrines were another feature of medieval urban sanitation, though they were often inadequate for the population they served. London, for example, had only 16 public latrines for a population of approximately 30,000 people in the late 14th century. These facilities typically emptied directly into rivers or large communal cesspits, and their limited number meant that many city residents had little choice but to rely on private or improvised solutions for their sanitation needs. The rivers that flowed through medieval cities served as both water sources and sewage disposal systems, creating obvious health hazards that weren't fully understood at the time. Many public latrines were built directly over rivers, allowing waste to flow away with the current. Private houses along riverbanks often featured garderobes that emptied directly into the water, adding to the contamination. Larger houses had enclosed latrines attached to or behind the home, which emptied into deep cesspits. Smaller residences made do with a bucket or close stool over a basin, either of which was emptied daily. They were usually carried to one of the streams that emptied into the nearest river and emptied into the water. Chapter 7: Medieval Hygiene Materials and Practices. Now that we have examined the various systems and professions involved in medieval waste disposal, let us explore the personal hygiene practices that followed these necessary bodily functions. The absence of toilet paper, as we know it today, meant that medieval people had to be creative and resourceful in maintaining cleanliness. After using the toilet, developing practices and materials that seem crude by modern standards, but were perfectly practical for their time. The concept of toilet paper was unknown in 13th century Europe, though it had already been invented and was in use in China since the 6th century. European medieval people instead relied on a variety of natural and manufactured materials to clean themselves after defecation. The choice of cleaning material often reflected social class, geographic location, and seasonal availability of different substances. Without modern conveniences, medieval people relied on various tools and materials to stay clean after using the toilet. Notably, toilet paper did not exist in 13th century Europe, at least not as we know it. In the absence of paper, people of all classes improvised with natural materials or cloth. Common wiping materials included handfuls of hay, straw, dry grass, or moss, which were cheap and readily available. For the common peasant, the most readily available wiping materials came directly from nature. Handfuls of hay, straw, dried grass, or moss were the standard choices for rural populations. These materials were free, abundant, and renewable, making them practical options for families with limited resources. Hay was particularly common because most rural households kept livestock and had ready access to both fresh and used bedding straw that could serve this secondary purpose. Leaves could be used as well, and in some locales, smooth stones or pieces of broken pottery might serve the purpose, a practice dating back to Roman times. Peasants usually stuck to these rustic options, but wealthier individuals often used softer fabrics, scraps of old cloth, rags, or even wool were employed to wipe themselves. For those who could afford them, cloth materials represented a significant upgrade in comfort and cleanliness. Scraps of old linen, wool, or cotton fabric were cut into appropriately sized pieces and used for personal cleaning. Wealthy households might maintain supplies of dedicated cleaning cloths, sometimes made from worn-out clothing, or household linens that had been retired from their original purposes. In some excavated medieval latrines, archaeologists have found remnants of linen and wool textiles, suggesting that higher status households discarded used cloth wipes, whereas poor households left behind coarser plant fibers. One medieval text indirectly refers to toilet hay catching fire from a candle, confirming that piles of hay were kept in privies for cleaning oneself. A 14th century source notes that hazel twigs were sometimes used like a brush to scrape oneself clean, and that washing with water, using the left hand, was practiced in some cultures. Indeed, washing one's backside with water was more common in the Islamic world. But even in Europe, the idea of rinsing with water existed when streams or basins were at hand. After attending to the call of nature, medieval people did try to wash their hands when possible. A morning hand and face wash was routine for virtually everyone. It helped shake off the fleas and sweat of the night. It was also customary to wash hands before and after meals in polite society, which implies that if water was available, one would clean one's hands after using the privy or chamber pot as well. In a castle, a basin and jug might be kept near the bedchamber or dining hall for washing up. Nobles could even afford perfumed water or soap made from animal tallow and lye for a better cleanse. Peasants, lacking fancy soap, might use plain water or sand to scrub their hands or wipe them on their clothes. The idea of personal hygiene was not absent in the Middle Ages. People knew the difference between clean and unclean, even if they didn't know about germs. A medieval farming family would rinse their hands if they had a well or river nearby, and nobility certainly valued scented baths, when they could get one, to avoid offending others at court. To combat the pervasive odors of waste, medieval folks employed fragrant herbs and other deodorizers. Castle privies were often strewn with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, or chamomile to mask the smell of human waste. Rushes, straw mats on the floors were mixed with flowers to give off a fresher scent underfoot. People also burned incense or carried pomanders, small balls or pouches of spices and herbs, especially in later medieval centuries, to hold to their nose in foul environments. The origin of the word garderobe, which later came to mean a clothes wardrobe, may lie in the practice of hanging clothes in the latrine closet. The ammonia from the waste would kill lice in the fabrics, thus guarding the robes, even as it created a potent smell. Chapter 8: Disease, Death, and the Consequences of Poor Sanitation. Having explored the intimate details of medieval bathroom practices, let us now step back to examine the broader consequences of these primitive sanitation systems. The ways people disposed of human waste in 13th century France had far-reaching effects on public health, urban planning, and the very survival of medieval populations. People in the Middle Ages have acquired something of a bad reputation when it comes to cleanliness, especially the peasantry. However, despite the general lack of running water and other modern amenities, there were common expectations of personal hygiene, such as regularly washing from a basin, especially the hands before and after eating. Yet the reality was that poor hygiene and sanitation in medieval cities contributed to the spread of disease, especially the devastating plague years of the mid to late 14th century in Europe. The waste disposal systems we've examined, from castle garderobes emptying into moats to urban cesspits leaking into groundwater, created perfect breeding grounds for the bacteria, parasites, and vermin that would periodically devastate medieval populations. The interconnected nature of medieval waste disposal and water supply created particularly dangerous conditions. Rivers that served as sewage outlets for castles and cities also provided drinking water for communities downstream. Wells dug near cesspits became contaminated with human waste, spreading waterborne diseases that medieval people could observe but not understand. The Black Death, which peaked from 1347 to 1352 CE, was just one, albeit the deadliest, of many waves of plagues and diseases which hit medieval Europe. Carried by fleas on rats, the bubonic plague killed anywhere between 30% and 50% of the population, wherever it took hold. The low standards of medieval hygiene certainly helped it along. The rats that spread plague were drawn to medieval waste sites, where they found abundant food and nesting opportunities. Urban areas, with their concentrated waste and limited sanitation infrastructure, became particularly vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Population densities in emerging cities, which involved housing large numbers of people in small quarters, and often including livestock under the same roof, merely helped to spread pestilence. Beyond the Great Plagues, everyday diseases took a constant toll on medieval populations. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were regular visitors to medieval communities, spread through contaminated water and poor waste management. What we now recognize as simple food poisoning could be fatal in a world without antibiotics or proper medical understanding. Ergotism, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, was caused by eating rye that had been poisoned by fungi. Poor food preparation and storage was a particular area of health risk, made worse by the proximity of waste disposal areas to food preparation spaces. Skin diseases were particularly prevalent, caused as much by poor diet as by uncleanliness, but exacerbated by the constant exposure to filth that characterized medieval life. The accumulated sewage in castle moats and urban cesspits attracted more than just rats. Flies, mosquitoes, and other disease-carrying insects thrived in these environments, creating additional vectors for illness. These pests would then move freely between waste areas and food preparation spaces, contaminating meals and spreading disease throughout communities. Medieval people understood, in their own way, that filth bred disease. They just attributed it to bad air or miasma rather than understanding the role of bacteria and parasites. This led them to focus on combating odors rather than addressing the underlying sanitation problems. The herbs scattered in garderobes, the perfumes carried by the wealthy, and the incense burned in public spaces were all attempts to ward off disease through scent. Chapter 9: The Social Hierarchy of Medieval Sanitation. Let us now examine more closely how social class determined not just where you lived, but how you relieved yourself in medieval France. The contrast between castle-dwelling nobles and peasant farmers in their bathroom habits was stark, reflecting the broader inequalities that defined medieval society. Access and convenience represented perhaps the most obvious divide. Nobility enjoyed ready access to indoor latrines or private chamber pots within their castles, meaning they rarely had to venture far when nature called. A lord's personal garderobe might even be attached to his bedroom suite. Peasants, by contrast, had no indoor plumbing and often had to walk outside to a pit or find a secluded spot outdoors. In bad weather or at night, this was difficult. Hence, peasants frequently used chamber pots or simply held it until morning. The noble's ability to relieve himself in the comfort of his stronghold was a luxury unknown to the commoner. While a castle lord might summon a servant to empty his chamber pot without ever leaving his heated bedchamber, a peasant family had to brave winter cold, summer heat, and nighttime darkness to answer nature's call. Privacy represented another crucial distinction. Castle garderobes were relatively private spaces, small closets, sometimes with doors or angled entries to shield the user. Nobles could do their business in solitude, perhaps attended by a servant standing guard outside. Peasants had little privacy. An outhouse might be a flimsy shack that anyone could hear or smell, and many poorer peasants just squatted in fields or behind buildings with no real screening. Using a communal village latrine also meant no exclusivity. One might have to share the facility or endure others' presence or waste. In short, the nobility's bathroom experience was more secluded, while peasants often answered nature's call in public view or communal settings. Hygiene and cleanliness reflected economic resources as much as personal preference. Noble latrines, though smelly, had some rudimentary hygiene measures. Castles could allocate resources to cleaning. Servants would throw water down the privy shaft or occasionally scrub it, and herbs were strewn to freshen the air. Wealthy families might use linen cloths or even wool scraps for wiping, which could be laundered or discarded, and they could wash their hands from basins of water after use. Peasants, on the other hand, lived in closer contact with filth. Their cesspits were near their homes and could attract flies and disease if not maintained. Most peasants used simple materials like straw or leaves to wipe, and washing hands with clean water was not always feasible on a farm. Overall, nobles had more means to attempt cleanliness and access to scented soaps or perfumes, whereas peasants' hygiene was limited by their harsher environment. The frequency of maintenance revealed another class divide. The nobles' privies could often go longer without being emptied, since castle latrine shafts dropped waste into moats or deep pits that were cleaned out only occasionally. Castle residents also had servants to empty chamber pots daily, keeping living quarters tidy. Peasant latrines required more frequent attention by the users themselves. A small cesspit by a cottage would fill up and had to be dug out regularly, especially if the waste was needed for fertilizing crops. In villages, shared cesspools might be emptied on a schedule by hired night soil men to avoid overflow. In essence, peasants dealt with their waste more directly, and often, while nobles were insulated from the nastiest aspects of waste disposal. Social attitudes toward sanitation also differed dramatically by class. For the nobility, a foul-smelling or poorly situated toilet was seen as an affront to comfort. Kings spent significant sums to upgrade royal garderobes for better odor control. They expected a certain degree of sanitation by medieval standards. Peasants, by necessity, were more tolerant of filth. Living alongside livestock and manure, they viewed human waste as just another part of the farm ecosystem. This doesn't mean they liked the smell or the mess, but their threshold for discomfort was certainly higher than that of a pampered lord. A noble might complain, in writing about malodorous privies, while a peasant would simply endure it, or cover the smell with straw and ashes as best as he could. Chapter 10. The Economics of Excrement. Having explored the social dimensions of medieval sanitation, let us now turn to an aspect that might surprise modern sensibilities: the economic value of human waste in 13th century France. In a world where nothing could be wasted and every resource had to be maximized for survival, human excrement represented a valuable commodity rather than merely a disposal problem. For rural peasant communities, human waste was an essential component of agricultural productivity. The night soil, collected from household chamber pots and village cesspits, wasn't simply disposed of. It was carefully managed as fertilizer for crops. Peasant families would mix human waste with animal manure, kitchen scraps, and other organic matter to create nutrient-rich compost that could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation. This practice required careful timing and knowledge. Human waste couldn't be applied directly to crops, as fresh excrement could damage plants and create health hazards. Instead, it was typically aged and composted for several months, allowing decomposition to break down harmful bacteria while concentrating the nitrogen and other nutrients that plants needed. The timing of waste application followed the agricultural calendar, typically applied to fields during fallow periods or well before planting to allow proper decomposition. The collection and transport of night soil became a specialized trade in larger communities. Urban gong farmers didn't simply dump their collected waste outside city walls. They sold it to farmers in surrounding rural areas who valued its fertilizing properties. This created an economic cycle where urban waste became rural wealth, connecting city and countryside through the commerce of excrement. The pricing of night soil reflected both its agricultural value and the difficulty of collection and transport. Gong farmers charged substantial fees for their collection services, often more per day than common laborers earned in a week, but they could also profit from selling the waste they collected. Farmers would pay premium prices for well-aged, high-quality night soil, particularly during planting seasons when demand peaked. Different types of waste commanded different prices in this medieval market. Human waste from wealthy households was considered more valuable than that from poor families, based on the belief that better-fed people produced more nutritious excrement. Castle waste, despite its association with luxury, was often less valuable because it was frequently contaminated with kitchen scraps and other non-agricultural materials. The transport of night soil required specialized equipment and techniques. Wooden barrels, carts with tight-fitting lids, and waterproof containers were essential for moving liquid and solid waste without spillage. The timing of transport usually occurred at night or during early morning hours to minimize public exposure and odor complaints. Storage of night soil for composting required careful management. Rural farmers would maintain dedicated areas away from their homes and water sources where collected waste could age properly. These composting areas needed protection from rain that could wash away nutrients, but also required proper drainage to prevent anaerobic conditions that could create dangerous gases. The seasonal nature of agriculture meant that demand for night soil fluctuated throughout the year. Spring planting seasons created peak demand, while winter months saw little market for waste products. Gong farmers and night soil dealers had to manage their collection and storage operations to align with these agricultural cycles. Urban authorities recognized the economic value of waste and sometimes regulated its collection and sale. Cities might issue licenses for night soil trade, ensuring that waste removal served both public health and economic development. Some municipalities even taxed the night soil trade, recognizing it as a legitimate commercial activity that contributed to urban revenues. The integration of waste management with agricultural production meant that disruptions to one system could affect the other. Plague years that decimated urban populations reduced the supply of night soil available to rural farmers. Conversely, poor harvests in rural areas could reduce demand for urban waste, creating public health problems in cities where cesspits went too long without emptying. Chapter 11: Water, Disease, and the Invisible Killers. Let us now examine one of the most deadly aspects of medieval sanitation, the contamination of water supplies. In 13th century France, the same water sources that sustained life also carried death, creating a vicious cycle that medieval people could observe, but not fully understand. The rivers that flowed through medieval France served multiple, contradictory purposes. The Seine, Loire, Rhône, and countless smaller waterways provided drinking water, powered mills, supported transportation, and received waste from countless communities along their banks. Castle garderobes emptied directly into rivers, urban latrines discharged into waterways, and rural communities used streams for both water supply and waste disposal. This created a deadly chain of contamination that spread disease across entire regions. Communities upstream would contaminate water that communities downstream depended upon for survival. The irony was that the very feature that made riverside locations attractive for settlement, access to fresh water, also made them vulnerable to waterborne diseases from distant sources. Medieval people understood that some water was bad and could cause illness, but they attributed this to visible contamination or unpleasant tastes and odors. They could not see the bacteria, parasites, and viruses that made water deadly, so they focused on what they could observe: color, smell, and taste. This led them to avoid obviously polluted water, while unknowingly consuming water that was bacteriologically dangerous but appeared clean. Well water, considered the purest available source, was often more contaminated than river water. Wells dug near cesspits, animal pens, or waste disposal areas became reservoirs of concentrated contamination. The belief that underground water was naturally filtered and purified led communities to site wells in locations that were convenient but dangerous. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and numerous parasitic infections spread through contaminated water supplies, causing recurring epidemics that could devastate entire communities. These diseases struck with particular force during hot summer months when water levels were low and contamination was concentrated, or during flooding when waste overflow contaminated previously clean sources. The symptoms of waterborne diseases were well known to medieval people, but the causes remained mysterious. They could observe that certain areas experienced more disease than others, that some seasons were more dangerous than others, and that some water sources seemed safer than others, but they couldn't identify the specific mechanisms of transmission. Medieval medical theory attributed disease to an imbalance of bodily humors, or to miasma, bad air that arose from rotting organic matter. This theory wasn't entirely wrong, as areas with poor sanitation did tend to have both bad smells and high disease rates, but it led to treatments and prevention strategies that missed the crucial role of water contamination. Some communities developed empirical knowledge about water safety that was remarkably accurate despite their limited understanding of disease transmission. They learned to avoid water from certain sources during specific seasons, to prefer flowing water over stagnant pools, and to locate wells away from obvious contamination sources. This knowledge was passed down through generations as practical wisdom rather than scientific understanding. The preparation of water for drinking sometimes inadvertently reduced disease transmission. Boiling water for cooking or brewing ale and wine killed many disease-causing organisms, though medieval people did this for taste and preservation rather than sanitation. The common practice of drinking weak ale or wine instead of water may have reduced disease transmission, though it created other health problems. Urban areas faced particular challenges with water contamination due to the concentration of waste sources and the complexity of water distribution systems. Cities attempted to maintain separate systems for clean water supply and waste disposal, but these systems often interconnected in ways that contaminated drinking water with sewage. Chapter 12: Daily Routines and Seasonal Variations. As we near the end of our journey through medieval sanitation, let us examine the daily rhythms and seasonal patterns that governed bathroom practices in 13th century France. These weren't random activities, but carefully structured routines that reflected the practical necessities and social customs of medieval life. The medieval day began before dawn for most people, and morning bathroom routines were among the first activities of the day. In castles, servants would be up early to empty chamber pots from the previous night, carrying their malodorous burdens to garderobes or waste disposal areas before the noble household awakened. The sound of servants moving through castle corridors with chamber pots was as much a part of the dawn chorus as roosters crowing or church bells ringing. For peasant families, morning bathroom needs had to be balanced against the urgency of agricultural work. During planting and harvest seasons, when every hour of daylight was precious, workers might delay their morning relief until they reached the fields where they would spend their day. This created a practical rhythm, where bathroom breaks coincided with work breaks, rather than personal convenience. The timing of meals influenced bathroom schedules throughout medieval society. The custom of washing hands before and after eating meant that hand-washing basins were regularly available, encouraging people to clean themselves after using toilet facilities. The main meal of the day, taken around midday, created a natural break when people could attend to personal needs without disrupting work schedules. Evening routines reflected the practical reality of medieval lighting. As darkness fell, venturing outside to use toilet facilities became uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. This encouraged reliance on chamber pots and indoor solutions, creating an evening routine of waste disposal that required morning cleanup. The cycle of filling chamber pots at night and emptying them in the morning created a daily rhythm that structured household schedules. Seasonal variations dramatically affected bathroom practices throughout medieval France. Winter brought obvious challenges as outdoor facilities became unpleasant or unusable. Frozen chamber pots, snow-blocked paths to outhouses, and the general misery of outdoor relief in cold weather forced people to rely more heavily on indoor solutions. Castle garderobes, already unpleasant, became torture chambers in winter when cold stone and frigid drafts made use nearly unbearable. Summer created different challenges as heat intensified odors and attracted insects to waste areas. The stench of castle moats and urban cesspits became overwhelming during hot weather, forcing communities to adapt their routines to minimize exposure. Some activities were shifted to cooler parts of the day, and waste disposal schedules were adjusted to reduce accumulation during peak heat. Spring brought the annual cycle of cesspit cleaning and waste disposal. As ground thawed and agricultural work resumed, the accumulated waste of winter needed to be removed and processed for use as fertilizer. This created a seasonal surge in gong farmer activity and a community-wide focus on sanitation maintenance that had been deferred during winter months. Autumn harvest seasons created unique bathroom challenges as entire communities worked in fields far from their normal facilities. Temporary outdoor relief became more common, and the social dynamics of communal work influenced when and where people could attend to personal needs. The urgency of harvest work often took precedence over comfort or privacy. Religious observances also influenced bathroom routines and schedules. Sunday restrictions on work affected waste collection and cesspit maintenance. Religious festivals and feast days altered normal meal schedules, which in turn affected bathroom timing. Some religious teachings emphasized cleanliness and personal hygiene, while others suggested that physical discomfort was spiritually beneficial. Market days and community gatherings created temporary changes in bathroom logistics as populations concentrated in town centers. Public facilities that were adequate for normal populations became overcrowded during market days, forcing people to seek alternative arrangements or endure uncomfortable waits. The agricultural calendar dominated rural bathroom practices. Planting seasons required workers to spend entire days in fields, necessitating outdoor relief and temporary facilities. Harvest time brought similar challenges, but with the added complication of processing and storing crops. Seasonal tasks like sheep shearing, winemaking, or grain threshing created temporary communities of workers who needed shared bathroom facilities. Chapter 13: Medicine, Mortality, and the Wages of Poor Sanitation. Having examined the daily realities of medieval bathroom practices, let us now confront the ultimate consequences of these primitive sanitation systems: the human cost, measured in disease, suffering, and premature death. The ways people managed human waste in 13th century France weren't merely inconvenient or unpleasant. They were literally matters of life and death. Medieval medical understanding was severely limited when it came to the connection between sanitation and health. Physicians recognized that some environments were more dangerous than others and they could observe the correlation between filthy conditions and disease outbreaks, but they couldn't identify the specific mechanisms that made poor sanitation deadly. The prevailing medical theory of the time blamed disease on an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or on miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad air arising from rotting organic matter. While the miasma theory wasn't entirely wrong, areas with poor sanitation did tend to have both bad smells and high disease rates. It led to treatments and prevention strategies that often missed the crucial role of contaminated water and direct contact with human waste. Dysentery was perhaps the most common and deadly disease directly linked to poor sanitation. This intestinal infection, caused by bacteria or parasites in contaminated water or food, could kill quickly through dehydration and blood loss. Medieval people called it the bloody flux and recognized it as particularly dangerous for children and elderly people. Entire families could be wiped out when dysentery spread through contaminated water supplies or unsanitary living conditions. Cholera outbreaks, though less common than dysentery, were devastating when they occurred. This waterborne disease could kill within hours of the first symptoms, causing such rapid dehydration that victims literally dried up before help could arrive. Medieval chronicles describe cholera epidemics as supernatural visitations, with people healthy at dawn found dead by evening. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water and food, but also through direct contact with infected waste. This made gong farmers and other sanitation workers particularly vulnerable, though they rarely understood why their profession carried such high mortality rates. Typhoid could persist in communities for months, striking seemingly at random and killing previously healthy adults. Parasitic infections were endemic in medieval populations, with intestinal worms affecting virtually everyone who lived in close contact with human waste. While rarely fatal by themselves, these parasites weakened immune systems and made people more vulnerable to other diseases. The cycle of reinfection through contaminated water and poor sanitation meant that deworming treatments were only temporarily effective. Skin diseases flourished in the unsanitary conditions of medieval life. Contact with human waste and contaminated water caused persistent infections that could become life-threatening in an age without antibiotics. What we would now treat as minor skin irritations could develop into systemic infections that killed otherwise healthy people. The mortality rates associated with poor sanitation were particularly devastating for children. Infant and child mortality in medieval communities often exceeded 50%, with disease rather than accident being the primary cause. Children were more susceptible to waterborne diseases, more likely to come into contact with contaminated materials through play, and less able to survive the dehydration and malnutrition that accompanied infectious diseases. Pregnancy and childbirth became even more dangerous in unsanitary environments. Postpartum infections, often caused by contaminated materials or unwashed hands during delivery, killed countless new mothers. The practice of disposing of birthing materials in household cesspits created additional contamination risks that affected entire families. Medieval people developed various folk remedies and preventive measures that sometimes helped, but often made things worse. They understood that some herbs had healing properties, and they recognized the importance of removing obviously contaminated materials from living areas. However, many traditional treatments, such as bloodletting for fever or applying poultices made from animal waste, actually increased infection risks. The economic cost of poor sanitation extended beyond individual suffering to affect entire communities. Epidemics could devastate local populations, reducing agricultural productivity and disrupting trade. The loss of skilled workers to disease meant that knowledge and expertise disappeared, setting back technological and social development. Recovery from disease was complicated by the continuous re-exposure that poor sanitation created. People who survived an initial infection often faced repeated bouts of the same disease because the environmental conditions that caused the first infection remained unchanged. This created a cycle of chronic illness that prevented full recovery and left populations permanently weakened. Chapter 14: Medieval Solutions to Impossible Problems. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, let us examine how medieval people adapted to their challenging sanitation circumstances and developed innovative solutions within the constraints of their technology and understanding. While these solutions seem primitive by modern standards, they represent remarkable ingenuity applied to fundamental human problems. Castle builders developed increasingly sophisticated waste disposal systems as they gained experience with the problems of concentrated populations. Early castles often featured simple garderobes that emptied into whatever convenient location was available, but later designs showed clear evidence of systematic planning for waste management. The projection of garderobe shafts beyond castle walls was a crucial innovation that solved multiple problems simultaneously. By ensuring that waste fell outside the fortification, builders prevented accumulation against foundations that could undermine structural integrity. The projection also reduced odors within living areas and created a psychological distance between inhabitants and their waste. Some castle designers experimented with multiple-stage waste disposal systems. Rather than dropping waste directly into moats or rivers, these systems collected waste in intermediate chambers where it could be processed or aged before final disposal. This reduced the immediate impact on water sources and created opportunities for waste recovery and reuse. The development of flushing systems, though primitive, demonstrated remarkable engineering insight. Diverting kitchen wastewater or rainwater into waste chutes created a mechanical solution to the problem of waste accumulation. Some castles featured elaborate systems of gutters and channels designed to optimize water flow for waste removal. Urban communities developed specialized professions and regulations to manage the challenges of concentrated waste production. The licensing and regulation of gong farmers represented an early form of public health administration, recognizing that waste management was too important to leave entirely, to private initiative. Cities experimented with zoning regulations that separated waste disposal areas from water sources and food preparation spaces. While these regulations were often violated and poorly enforced, they represented an understanding that spatial organization could influence health outcomes. The development of public latrines showed urban planners attempting to provide community solutions for individual needs. While never adequate for the populations they served, these facilities demonstrated recognition that sanitation was a public responsibility rather than merely a private concern. Rural communities developed sophisticated composting and waste processing techniques that maximize the agricultural value of human waste while minimizing health risks. The timing and methods of waste application to fields showed deep understanding of biological processes, even if the scientific mechanisms weren't understood. Peasant families learned to optimize the location and construction of their waste facilities based on generations of accumulated experience. The placement of cesspits The design of simple outhouses and the timing of waste removal all reflected practical knowledge about managing sanitation in resource-constrained environments. Some communities developed cooperative waste management systems where multiple families shared facilities and labor. These arrangements demonstrated understanding that coordination could achieve better outcomes than individual efforts alone. The integration of waste management with other household and agricultural activities showed remarkable efficiency in resource use. Nothing was wasted, and every byproduct was considered for potential value. This holistic approach to resource management provided lessons that remain relevant today. Medieval people also developed social and cultural adaptations that helped them cope with unpleasant sanitation realities. Customs around privacy, cleanliness, and social interaction evolved to minimize embarrassment and health risks while maintaining community cohesion. The use of aromatic substances and ritual cleansing reflected understanding that psychological comfort was important for maintaining social order, even in challenging physical circumstances. While these practices didn't eliminate health risks, they made difficult conditions more bearable and preserved human dignity in degrading circumstances. Chapter 15. What Medieval Sanitation Teaches Us. As we reach the end of our journey through the toilets, garderobes, and cesspits of 13th century France, let us reflect on what this exploration reveals about human nature, social organization, and the eternal challenge of managing our most basic biological needs. The story of medieval sanitation is ultimately a story about adaptation and survival. Faced with the fundamental problem of waste disposal in societies without modern technology, medieval people developed solutions that, while primitive and often dangerous, allowed their communities to survive and sometimes thrive. These solutions reflected their values, their understanding of the world, and their constraints, creating a complex system that served both practical and social needs. The class distinctions that characterized medieval bathroom practices reveal broader truths about how societies organized themselves around scarcity and privilege. The difference between a castle garderobe and a peasant cesspit wasn't just about comfort, it was about power, resources, and social position. These distinctions reinforced hierarchies and created different life experiences for people born into different circumstances. Yet even within these stark inequalities, we see evidence of human ingenuity and dignity. Peasant families who carefully composted their waste for agricultural use demonstrated sophisticated understanding of biological processes. Gong farmers who risked their health to maintain community sanitation provided essential services that kept societies functioning. Castle builders who designed elaborate waste disposal systems showed engineering creativity within severe constraints. The health consequences of medieval sanitation practices remind us how fundamental public health infrastructure is to human welfare. The diseases, suffering, and premature death that resulted from poor sanitation weren't inevitable features of pre-modern life. They were consequences of specific technological and social limitations that could be, and eventually, were overcome. The economic dimensions of medieval waste management reveal how societies create value from necessity. The transformation of human waste from disposal problem to agricultural resource showed remarkable efficiency in resource utilization. The emergence of specialized professions around waste management demonstrated how societies develop expertise to solve challenging problems. The daily rhythms and seasonal patterns of medieval bathroom practices illustrate how basic biological needs shape social organization. The timing of waste disposal, the location of facilities, and the coordination of individual and community needs all required social cooperation and cultural adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, the story of medieval sanitation reminds us that the conveniences we take for granted, flush toilets, sewage treatment, clean water supplies, represent extraordinary achievements in human development. These systems didn't emerge automatically, but required centuries of experimentation, investment, and social organization. The medieval approach to sanitation also teaches us about the interconnectedness of individual and community health. The nobleman in his castle garderobe wasn't isolated from the consequences of poor sanitation in the peasant villages downstream. Disease and contamination spread across social boundaries, making public health a shared concern that required collective solutions. Looking back at medieval sanitation practices, we might feel superior about our modern systems, but we should also recognize the continuities. Many of the challenges that medieval people faced, managing waste in concentrated populations, balancing individual privacy with community needs, allocating resources for infrastructure, remain relevant today, albeit in different forms. The story of how medieval people managed their most basic biological needs reminds us that human dignity and social cooperation can persist even in difficult circumstances. Despite the unpleasant realities of medieval sanitation, people maintained social relationships, developed cultural practices, and created meaning in their lives. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those medieval families huddled around their simple hearths, planning their next day's work, while a chamber pot waited quietly in the corner, or for the castle lord sitting in his stone-cold garderobe, reminded that even power and privilege couldn't entirely insulate him from the fundamental realities of human biology. These people lived, worked, loved, and died in circumstances that would challenge our modern sensibilities, yet they created communities, raised families, and built societies that endured for centuries. Their story is our story, a reminder of both how far we've come and how much we share with people across the centuries who face the same basic challenges of being human. In the end, the history of medieval sanitation is really a history of human adaptation, ingenuity, and perseverance in the face of fundamental challenges. It's a story that reminds us that civilization isn't just about grand achievements and noble ideals. It's also about solving the practical, unglamorous problems that make daily life possible. And with that rather aromatic thought, we close our exploration of bathroom and sanitation in 13th century France. Tomorrow's problems will be different, but the human need to manage waste, maintain health, and preserve dignity will continue. Sleep well and be grateful for the flush of modern plumbing.